Welcome to this new Tech Captains episode. I'm Ron, and today with Gareth, we're interviewing Aviv Ben-Yosef, tech consultant, executive consultant. You've been active in the industry for more than 20 years. Hi, Aviv. How are you today?
Hey, I'm great. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So actually, we met last year after I read, I think it was your first book, The Tech Executive Operating System. And just
hmm
before we started the podcast with Gareth, we discussed that, in the Tech Executive Operating System, you also mentioned a few things that personally I've implemented, but we'll get to that later. I don't know if like maybe for everyone listening, maybe for 1 or 2 minutes you can tell us about your background.
Yeah, sure. So I'm based in Israel, and I've been coding since I was 9 years old. I served in one of the Israeli army's cyber units, and later I was an IBM for a year, and I ran away. I was the first employee at startups. Had a bunch of fun, and for the past 10 years, I've been independent. At the beginning, I worked with a bunch of startups as a freelance coder, and a good chunk of them ended up IPOing or now unicorns and that sort of stuff. And slowly I transitioned into a fractional CTO as a service kind of role. And for the past 3, 4 years, I've been mainly doing CTO and CEO advisor and coaching. And like right now, what really gets me going is helping teams just get better. I work with, it's easy to work with the teams that are on fire and put out the fire, but what I really like is working with teams that are doing good and helping them do even better.
And just before we get to that, like, how would you define the fractional CTO compared to what you're doing now? Like, what's the real
So
difference?
yeah, so a fractional CTO, or it used to be called a CTO as a service, I think, but now fractional CTO is all the rage, is when you have a single person that works with several companies and helping them as if that person were the CTO. So I'm helping you with decisions about your technology. Maybe I'm helping you hire people, decide what the team should do, actually manage a few people on the engineering team, that sort of stuff. And it's similar to what a CTO would do, but just fractionally, because you don't usually work full time with any one client. But I transitioned to a role where I work with companies that have these tech executives, and I help them do better because I enjoy. I learned that I enjoy more, teaching people how to fish than showing them that I can fish really nice.
And I think the fractional role is useful, isn't it, for tech companies of a certain size where they need that
Yeah,
experience, they need the role, but they can't afford to pay for someone with the experience. So then you come in
no, definitely.
10 or 15 hours a week or something. Yeah.
Yeah, no offense meant to anyone who is doing this. I just found out that I enjoy better to be someone who works with the existing CTOs, or sometimes I work with CEOs and helping them, than being the fractional CTO. But it often is the case where it is very helpful, especially for smaller companies. Or if as a CEO, if your CTO just walks up and leaves, you sometimes need an interim CTO or a fractional CTO to help you out for a couple of months, and I think that makes a lot of sense.
And obviously because you've been coaching and specialized in helping technology executives for a number of years now. Some people might wonder, like, but does he still have actually any hands-on the ground experience? Like, is his advice still relevant today? Is what you're saying still relevant compared to what maybe you experienced 10 years ago?
hmm That's a fair question, and I would say that right now people rarely come up to me because they need advice when it comes to a specific technological decision, because I'm no longer as sharp. I code, I mainly code as a hobby now because I like it, but I don't code professionally for like at least 3 years now, and I am no longer up to date about any framework and what's the best way to do this. And whenever I try and write code, I found that I'm slower than I used to be. But most of my work nowadays is about how do I make my engineering organization work better, and how do we work better with product? How do I make the CEO understand what we're doing? And those are the things that aren't changing as fast as the technology itself.
And in the tech executive operating system, if I remember correctly, you also mentioned how to handle one-to-ones with your team and to always have them. So I've actually been doing it, for a year now, like exactly what you prescribed in it. And I think it's very good to keep an ongoing conversation on both sides, rather than
Hmm.
having a yearly or a biannually like review, and then it feels like, okay, now that's gonna be big and everybody's worried and nobody wants to get in. And so I wonder if maybe you want to share with everybody listening one or two stories that you give in that book before we move to the new one coming up later this month.
All right, sure. So I first of all, I think that one-on-ones are now more popular or taking as a default for many new managers in tech, which is great. But it didn't used to be the case just a few years ago. And still there are people who think they're doing one-on-ones but aren't really doing one-on-ones. For example, you might be you might have the meeting scheduled on your calendar, but 50% of the times where it pops up, you're like, I think we can skip this one. Or you actually sit down with your employee, but it's not really a one-on-one, and it's more of a tell me what you're working on and I'm checking up on you and seeing that everything is going correctly. And for me, one-on-ones are one of the main tools that you have as a leader, as a manager, to help your people grow, to make sure that they're on the right track, to provide them with feedback, and to give them space to provide you with feedback. Because after all, this is something that we've learned when it comes to software delivery. We have agile thinking because we've learned that if you do things in smaller increments and you have iterations, it usually is better than doing one huge waterfall project and only learning after 8 months that what we did isn't the right thing. And I think the same thing should apply to one-on-ones. People should constantly get feedback about how they're progressing and what you're expecting. And one of the worst things I see still is that many companies, when they onboard new employees, those employees don't really get any feedback for like the first 3 months. And I say
Yeah.
that that's like the worst idea you can have, because those 3 months, I call them the window of malleability. That's the time where someone is actually most open to getting feedback and changing how they work. Once too much time passes, you lose the new car smell. They get used to how they're doing things. And if after 3, 4 months you tell me, hey, this is not actually what we thought, it's like too late. We just wasted so much time. So start providing feedback right off the gate. I think it
and
really helps
and
everyone.
and how the non-manager can use that one-to-one also for their interest and they improve, and
Well, that can be difficult because I regularly hear about the quiet engineer, the one who just sits in the one-on-one and responds to what you ask, but they never pose their own questions. And I think that employees definitely should view this as an opportunity, first of all, to provide feedback about, for example, I've been working on this and I feel like we could have been doing this better, or I don't understand why this is so important, or why we prioritize that, or let me know about an idea you have. And if you do that, you really increase your exposure to the organization. And this is, I believe, something that's crucial for real seniority. If you want to become a more senior engineer, it is not plainly about knowing the tech in and out, being the best when it comes to, I don't know, React or whatever. I want you to be the best at understanding your specific company, the product you're working on, because at the end of the day, that's what really matters. We can take the same the same people and put them in different companies, and in one company they would shine and in another they won't, because they're not connected to the product, because they don't understand how to prioritize things. There's a very clear limit to, even if you're working with the best product person in the world, to how much they can provide you with answers, right? And we all know that coding is hundreds of micro decisions every day. So if you have a good context and you use one-on-ones and you use other occasions to learn more about the company and to ask for exposure to other parts of it, you will become a better engineer because you'll make better decisions. And that's really how you accelerate your growth and how fast you gain experience to become more senior, and not just, again, for the technical part of it, but for the part that matters for the company. I call this product mastery usually.
So I think Yeah, I think one-on-ones are really important. I listened to your podcast. I agree with pretty much everything you said on it. I've managed the largest batch of engineers I managed was about 130, and even when I had 130 engineers, I still made time to have the 15-minute conversation like you talk about with at least a couple of times a year, just as if I was walking up and having a coffee with them. And I think today, because we have teams that are so spread out, a lot of people working from home, it's become even more important, hasn't it? One of the things I did wonder, though, is where do you, if you're sitting there as the CTO or VP of engineering, and you've got all of this structure underneath you, and you have line managers in there, maybe team leads who have engineers reporting to them. How do you explain to those line managers the context of these one-on-ones? Because I've seen comments where they feel like, as a CTO or whatever, you're doing this to find some information out about them. Do you know what I mean? You're sort of going behind their backs. How would you explain it to someone who's sort of sitting there in the middle of this process? We all going and speaking to people that report to them.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, first of all, everyone should know that this is something that you do regularly, because I've seen, the engineer that gets an invite out of the blue and they're like, oh, am I getting fired, right?
Yeah,
so they need to know
wrong?
that this is something that is just happening regularly, like nothing's wrong. And second, I hope that in many companies, your line managers, for example, have experienced it before because they were already your ICs prior, if they weren't, hired specifically to become managers, and then they experience it themselves. But if they haven't, you should tell them precisely what this is for. Sometimes this is about you getting a vibe of what's happening, not because you're trying to spy on your managers, but because you know that there's value in hearing things from different points of view. So I oftentimes work with, for example, a single CTO in a company, and we can work together for 6 months. But every few months, I will say I think I would benefit from listening to a conversation or talking to some of their managers, because no matter how objective you think you are a sole prism into the company, into your team. So even if I talk to the manager a lot, I only see how he sees things. And there's value in listening to others and seeing, oh, maybe there's a communication issue. Maybe people feel more comfortable speaking not to their boss. And that's something that we need to address. And also, this is also about providing them, the ICs, with a clear path to people higher up, that they can feel like they're getting the attention. They can ask questions that maybe don't make sense at the line manager level. And lastly, I just think that this is something that is healthy, right? It is. We just need to talk about, this is what we value as a culture, where people know that not everything has to go through hierarchy and the chain of command. I would rather not get in the, if you're talking to someone every 6 months, I would rather not get them asking for a raise or something out of the blue. But, and I would explain that this is not for that. But I do want to see how people feel about the company. And I usually would ask something like, if you look at the past 6 months, what do you think the trend is? Are things going better? Are they the same? Are there areas where we are now lacking and that we didn't used to? And getting that, crowdsourced data from 170 people has a lot of value.
Yeah, definitely.
Can you, Aviv, tell us more about your new book coming out this month, Capitalizing Your Technology to Disrupt and Dominate Your Markets? Sorry for my accent.
No, that's fine. I've got an accent as well. So, first of all, I know that the title is quite a mouthful. That's what the publisher wanted. But it's basically different than my first one, which came out pretty much exactly 2 years ago, because that one was for the CDOs I'm working with. And this new one is targeted at the rest of the co-founders that I've been working with, or the non-technical executives I see, because a lot of the time they feel insecure about what R&D is doing. R&D is a good chunk of any healthy startup, and they have a lot of power. Sometimes the CTO is a co-founder and has even more power. And I regularly hear from CEOs or heads of sales or whatever, who come up to me and say, the CTO is saying that this is not possible, or that this will take 6 months, or that we should get more people, or whatever. It does make sense. And oftentimes, this, for me, this is like getting my car to the mechanic. I have no idea, right? They can tell me that they need to replace the wings, and I'll say, okay. And the new book is for that, for helping those people get, I call it get some tech literacy. I want them to understand a bit more about how healthy tech organizations work, how to communicate in a way that helps them, how to best utilize them, because I can tell you that many CEOs don't feel like that the CTO belongs in the boardroom, for example. I'm like, no, this is precisely where they belong if you're a tech startup, right? Technology has to be a core part of your strategy, for example. So this is for aiding them. And I find that it just ended up being pretty much organically that each book is aimed at helping one party in a company get closer to the other. So it's kind of working on bridging the gap.
So you said about the book, you said that it helps to bridge, I think the actual quote was, bridge the culture gap between C-suite and R&D. Now, I've always considered that a pretty fundamental role of a CTO. And why do you think so many companies struggle with it, or so many CTOs, CEOs struggle with it?
Well, I think that, first of all, there are many CTOs who feel like, I've been coding all my career, and even if I'm okay with managing people, what I do is always tech related, right? I'm the geek, I'm the nerd. I'm not doing the businessy part. The business part is crazy complicated, is hard to understand. That's not what I do, and I get that, right? And we all have some form of imposter syndrome, but I don't think that this is something that must happen. And to add to that, I see a lot of times where the co-founders are not technical and the CTO is an employee, and they, either because they're cautious, either because in the past it didn't work out, or because they think you're too busy, so they don't want to burden you with all the executive meetings, with getting to the board. If there's no specific item on the agenda you should be addressing or whatever. And I think that we just sometimes don't realize how important this is as a prerequisite for being a real executive in the company. And I've seen also, and this might be more relevant to small startups, but I've seen many companies where the titles don't really mean anything. So maybe you're a VP, maybe you got a C-level title, but people don't think of you as a peer when it comes to, are you really part of the real executive team? I've worked even at unicorns where there was, the real executive meeting and not just the one with all the VPs. And at the end of the day, people need to understand what's technology's role in all of this. You're not just an executor, you're part of coming up with the strategy and with making the vision come true.
Do you think that's where the whole VP of engineering thing came about? Because that's, I think that's a relative, it seems like in the UK, I think it came from the US, that role sort of became much more prominent in the last 10 years. You think that's sort of come in to fit that gap a little bit? That's the person who might have become a CTO, but perhaps doesn't want to have more of that exposure in the C-level team. And then you have a CTO who's much more happy to do that and wants to be less technically involved. And then you have this person coming in and sort of filling that gap, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. I see it actually happening both ways. It's pretty frequent that I see a couple of co-founders. There's the CEO and the CTO, and the CTO is a technical whiz, but at some point realizes they would prefer not to manage a lot of people. They don't want to do all the people and process stuff. They just want to be the head of the technical stuff. They want to think about the architecture. They want to do innovation. Maybe they want to speak at conferences, whatever. And that's where people sometimes bring in this VP of engineering to take care of the people and processes. And then the CTO is free to be more of a free electron in the company. Sometimes it's even sort of a wild card executive, because I've seen many co-founders, CTOs who do everything for a while, and wherever there's a hole, they will be sent there to help, and that makes sense. But I've actually seen the other way around as well, where the company CTO just really wants to be just technical. They don't care about the businessy part, and then a VP of engineering or a chief. I've seen a chief engineering officer or an SVP of engineering or someone who gets started with a bit more gravitas is brought in to play the role of that technical persona in the boardroom, because the company eventually realizes that there's a gap here and we need someone to fill it.
I like the idea of being a free electron or free radical. Might see if I can get that somewhere in my job title.
If I remember in your last, I like sometimes to ask people for fun or horror story they had in the past. But I remember one from your book that's actually quite fun and ingenious. I think, if I remember correctly, because it was last year, where during your military service you needed to map the hardware, and you used the compact disk eject function. Do you
Yeah.
want to describe that?
This sounds interesting.
Yeah, well, I don't know how many people still will realize what we're talking about. We're talking about the the old age where hardware servers had CD trays that you would press a button, they would eject out, and you would see what well it would actually put the CD in the tray. Now, in my army service, I used to. I'm weird this way. I really liked doing all sorts of pranks using the computer and really being annoying to a bunch of people. So once I realized that I can connect to people with my admin rights and just, you're sitting with your workstation, and back then workstations had CD trays, and I would just code it so that randomly every X minutes the CD tray would pop out. Usually it would bang you on your knee and get back in. And I did this again because I'm annoying and that's what I like to do. But one time we got into this server room and we had, military intelligence stuff. We really had to find the right server to swap really fast because it meant we were losing data that we had no way to recoup. And we get into the room, and usually all the servers have these little labels on them, but something there in the room caused the labels to actually peel off, and they were all on the floor. And we were like, oh my god, how are we going to find this specific server that we need to replace fast? And I was like, all of a sudden I had this insight. I can just SSH into the server, eject, and I'll see in the rack which one spits out the CD tray. And that's how, because I used to be this annoying kid, I had that idea really, really fast. And that's how I think creativity can really emerge out of playing, and we have to tinker around. I actually have another story that I think is not published anywhere that's related. Another army story. Israel was in the middle of a small war. Let's not get into the details too much, but we had to create two systems really, really fast. And because of cyber policies within the organization, those two systems could not communicate directly. We couldn't, have a networking cable go between them. And to get the approval would take us a couple of days, and we needed something to happen really, really fast. We just needed system A to tell system B, event has happened now, you can start. And people were thinking, what can we do? Maybe we can start going up the chain of command to get some special approval. And we were waiting for a hack, a bureaucratic hack to solve this. And I was like, I've got a crazy idea. Hear me out. And I was like, let's set up this computer with a keyboard right against the other computer so that when we eject, the CD tray will just hit the enter on the numpad and go back, and we'll just get an event that, hey, this has happened, you can now get going. So you can see that I think in a very weird way, but I do believe that if you play around with things and you tinker, you eventually get some nice creativity happening out of it, or at least a nice story.
Yeah. I mean, that's a different version of the whole sneaker net thing, isn't it? The air gapping by walking from one machine to another with a floppy disk, whatever, back in the day. Yeah.
Exactly.
I watched you had to talk about product mastery, which I thought was good. And you mentioned the Uber example, which I think I'd heard before about the CEO becoming an Uber driver and getting to see the experience from a customer's point of view. Mm-hmm. And I listened to that and I thought, and it's an obvious idea in some ways, but is it different to the idea of, eat your own dog food? Because that's been around for quite a while. And why do you think people still don't do it? Why don't C-level people still don't, try their own products?
Yeah. So first of all, people don't do it because we're busy, or because we think we know enough. We know. I'm guessing the CEO of Uber, he's like, I go on Ubers, right? I take Ubers. I know how it works. And this was about the other way around. When he was just taking trips as a driver, an incognito driver, when no one knew he was the CEO, all of a sudden he saw how annoying the app can be for a driver, or how easy it was for him to become one of those drivers who don't take trips when he realizes that he's going to come back through traffic, and then he understands why his users on the other end are not getting enough trips, that sort of stuff. He started really understanding those things. And I think that we need to realize that even if we knew, things constantly update, things constantly change, and it's good for us to reacquaint ourselves with what is going on. And also, we think that we're too busy, or that we get enough information from the product people or whatever. And I don't think that everyone in Uber need to become Uber drivers, a day a month or something. But you do need to maintain some constant connection with the product. And if you're working on developer tools, amazing, you can dog food all day. But if that's not the case, you need to find ways to do that. So I know, for example, companies that the salespeople regularly record the sales meetings, the sales calls, and then take out interesting bits about what people said about this feature, or what they really didn't understand, or what really clicked with them. And then they take those bits and create an internal podcast for the company, for the engineers to listen and hear directly how users speak about their product, about the features. And that really helps you realize what's important, what people care about. I think it also helps with motivation. And I also know a company where they regularly have each and every engineer, actually everyone in the company, do a day in customer success once a quarter. And because
Yes.
you do that,
Yeah.
you really see what's hurting, and you get a lot of good ideas, because you go back to your work later and you're like, I think that I can help the customer success people with that problem that keeps on occurring. Or you're working on a new feature and you can already sense, oh, this is going to really annoy the customer success people. And that's, you preemptively fix it. So I think it's very important. We just need to drop our ego and tell ourselves, even though I knew things, and even if I'm still dog fooding to an extent, you can be dog fooding, like using the Uber as a passenger, but maybe you're missing on crucial parts of the app or of the product. So think about that.
Well, I think there's so it's a subtle. It's also missing who your users actually are, isn't it? Because I suppose in the case of Uber, it's easy to think the users are my customers and the drivers are just employees or contractors, whatever they are. But actually, the driver's a user as well. It's just a different class of user, isn't it? And it's realizing
Precisely.
that. Yeah.
Well, on these wise words of advice, we will conclude today's podcast. Thank you so much, Aviv, for coming today. And do you want to remind everyone? So your book, can we get it on Amazon, other places? Like where will it be available? When this
Yeah.
podcast gets
So
published, your book is live.
all right, amazing. So you can grab your copy, just go to capitalizing.tech. That's the new TLD I'm using. And you can grab your copies there. It's on Amazon and it's on the publisher's site. And if you want to listen to my own podcast, if you want to get some more of my stuff, you can check out avivben-yosef.com, because I've got a bunch of free stuff over there.
Perfect. We'll add the links into the description for anybody listening. Thank you, Aviv.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Aviv. Really enjoyed
Thank
it.
you,
Thank
guys.
you. Goodbye. Goodbye.
Ciao.